Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for sharing this time with me. I also thank the Cuban Attorney General's office for inviting me. Like the previous speaker well said, what is the model of criminal liability of corporate bodies? I will only give you an idea, and I hope that at the end of my presentation you agree with me. In 1897, at the request of a physician who couldn't understand math or applied math, a law was approved in the state of Indiana under which a numerical value of pi, was no longer equivalent to 3.1415, and then by law it was passed that it should be 3.16 instead of the traditional 3.14. This law is, of course, nonsense. The same nonsense according to the majority doctrine in Germany and a minority sector in the Spanish doctrine, and as well as in other doctrines of jurists who still don't understand how you can establish criminal responsibility by corporate bodies when it is impossible to talk about a capacity of action, a capacity of culpability, and that is very, very difficult to link it to the principle of the personality or of person for the imposition of penalties. In 1997, 100 years later, the Cuban Criminal Code included the responsibility by corporate bodies. In Europe, countries like France and Denmark included the criminal liability of corporate bodies, and as usual, when you're a pioneer in a given area, you're very cautious and you use very clear ideas, but in the long run, they will not be sufficient to explain what should actually be considered or established as a full responsibility of the corporate body. The Cuban Criminal Code only devotes Article 16 to establish the limits or elements of this responsibility or liability. Article 24 explains the penalties or sanctions for this type of responsibility, and Article 52 and 53 to specify on what circumstances that responsibility may be alleviated or aggravated. But three things are striking in terms of this responsibility or liability. First, it does not specify the types of crimes. So in principle, it's for all. Then the range of aggravating and alleviating circumstances applied to corporate bodies is very limited. It's quite striking that Article 52 considers as an alleviating or exempting circumstance under motives, but not in terms of relief or remedies for natural persons. The criminal liability of corporate bodies is only established for actions within the corporate body itself, within the course of business of that specific corporate bodies, and defined by the actions of their representatives or by agreements of the partners of that corporate body. This model is clearly a model of self-responsibility. Dr. Sanchez-Nagar was before me making reference to the different models, the potential duality of hetero-responsibility and self-responsibility. I think that this self-responsibility has gained ground. Corporate bodies must answer for what they've done, and a different thing is how they will answer for what they're doing. Like I said, the Cuban Criminal Code also clearly adopts this model of self-responsibility, but that is not the case for other countries that have more modern criminal codes. in the Cuban Criminal Code, there is no attention to the model of the impact of the organization as part of the corporate body criminal responsibility. In the early 21st century, this idea of the lack of proper organization within corporate bodies, together with the compliance model, I rather use the fulfillment of standards rather than using the term compliance. But there will be some states that will rather follow this model, and there's also a clear reference in 2001, Decree 231 in Italy. In 2002, the public accounting and the protection of investors, an act in 2002. Then in 2009, the important law of Chile, and in 2010, the Privy Act against corruption in the UK. Those are models. It doesn't matter whether they are strictly criminal or administrative models. It doesn't matter whether it is limited to corruption-related aspects like in the UK. In the case of the States, in terms of accounting and investment, the idea of the stock market, the truth is that in all those rules and laws, they explain that in order to prevent certain crimes, organizations or corporate bodies must have models for ensuring the compliance of standards. So the corporate bodies are responsible of their own controls in order to prevent crimes are committed within their organization, or the crimes they're going to answer for are not committed. The previous speaker made reference to the failed Spanish law of 2010, which was wrong. Oftentimes, when you address a problem, the first time you do it wrongly. Then we had the law of 2015 that corrected some of deficiencies of the previous one, and now we have a rather appropriate law. So what should be the trend in the future? It doesn't matter whether we have a model of a terror responsibility or responsibility of third parties or self-responsibility. It doesn't matter whether we can establish the criminal liability of corporate bodies. This phenomenon is here to stay. There won't be any reforms eliminating the criminal responsibility or liability of corporate bodies. So I think that what we need to do now is to determine what model is going to be more effective for ensuring that corporate bodies answer for their responsibilities. I think that it has to do with the requirement of the compliance systems in other branches of law, like in labor law, with the prevention of labor risks, models in civil law with the models that require the protection of data. In the branch of business law, the models that provide certain precautionary measures to prevent money laundering. If all those models have succeeded in other branches of law, the most evident model is that of preventing risk in the workplace that rather tends to prevent responsibility for accidents in the workplace, then why should it fail in criminal law? We often think that we are very different from other branches of law, and societies are more demanding, and we tend to follow some principles instead of meeting the current realities of our society that make us rethink the way in which we do things. When my young brother fell and started crying, my mother immediately came into the room and beat me. But I said, but I didn't do anything. Why are you hitting me? Well, precisely because you didn't do anything and you were supposed to take care of your brother. That is sort of the idea. Then Madam Goite will talk about compliance and criminal risk.
The responsibility of legal persons must be associated to new times, to a risk society, the way of understanding criminal law. It's not enough to say that nothing has been done. We must understand that we can be demanded responsibility because we are compelled to have this responsibility. This new model pretends compel legal persons, be them private, public, of a commercial nature. All legal persons that have committed a crime must adopt these prevention measures that can avoid not only the environmental risks but also behaviors of a criminal nature that will harm or danger the interests that must be protected. Companies are told what is the best way to avoid legal responsibility. Well, you have to establish a system, a control system, a supervision system, a surveillance system of what is done in your company, a system by which you can prevent any misconduct of your representatives, your managers, your associates, but of any person that can make decisions and link this decision to the company. This is a right in which, or this is a law in which we have imprudent laws, and we need answers for a society that demands different types of commitments. In the German doctrine, in its criminal code, highways in Germany were the best highways in Europe. Today they are the worst. Why? Because they were the first that were built. So there are systems in Dominican Republic, in Europe, for example, Portugal, that are much more modern and address the new situation. We need to see what is demanded by society because the legal responsibility of legal persons demands in the implementation of compliance models. I don't know if it should be to the extent that they could be demanded, and if there is no compliance, you could be punished, administratively speaking. You cannot be exonerated from legal responsibility. You can say that you try to avoid certain crimes in my company, but how do you show? What are the evidences you can submit if the compliance model is not present in your decision-making process or is not known by your workers or by the investors or by the suppliers? It's very difficult for you to explain that you did everything possible. When you go to a company and tell them that there is legal responsibility since 2010 for all these crimes, and you have to have this instrument, and they say, no, I already have this instrument, and then they say, well, where do you have it? And they say, well, I'll bring it for you tomorrow. But that is not the issue here. If you ask a worker and if she knows what is the compliance model in the company cannot say that they have implemented this model. This compliance manual is essentially characterized by two things. It has to be a compliance model detailing the behaviors that have to be prevented or avoided within the company. That manual that has to be implemented and explained and understood by all the members of the company must also have a compliance body. This is the key element for implementing this model. This will be a whistleblower that will control and supervise that what the compliance manual states is being actually implemented. A person that to whom you have to report defaults and that body will report to whoever is responsible about the non-compliance with the manual. Then you have other measures that you can use to improve the situation. This body, that can be a collective body, it could be one person, will, through its regular work, detect things that have to be corrected. How do we establish or harmonize an old model when there is no regulation in the criminal code? So we are using certifications. Certifications have existed always in terms of quality, in terms of the environment, in terms of international standards, ISO standards, etc. Now what happens? The company draws a manual, compliance manual, and that compliance manual is submitted to a certification agency that is private. And that charges for doing this manual. I can submit a standardized compliance manual, and then I will pay you to certify that my manual is adequate. And if you say it's not adequate, I'm not going to pay. So what do we need? We need to standardize these protocols. We need to make sure that there are no other interests in the certification process, and that the only interest is to prevent crime. The great challenge of these models is to establish certification authorities, international certification authorities, to accredit a study stating that that compliance model serves the purpose of not only to prevent or to exonerate you from a legal responsibility, but also to prevent the crime. We are not talking about quality manuals. We are not talking about ethical codes. We are not talking about a number of commitments that social commitments assumed by the company. We're talking about something concrete that has to be examined by experts. When we request a certification, an ISO certification, the certificate is provided by an engineer, a technician, not a jurist, because till now jurists knew nothing about this compliance model nor this certification process. So we need to have these compliance models. We have to adjust our programs with specific contents. I think this is a great challenge. We have the dogmatic debate about responsibility and non-responsibility. I think the idea is to compel companies to have protocols that certify that everything is being done correctly. We have to establish specific bodies, independent bodies, or the compliance body has to be part of the company. We need compliance bodies that are more or less independent, and the state must deal with public certification, which in my view will guarantee that the company has done everything possible to prevent any crime. That is the idea I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation. We need to say yes to legal responsibility, but we need certification, public certification. Thank you.